They told us history was written in stone, but what they didn't tell us is who held the chisel. For generations, we've accepted narratives handed down without question, as if truth were a hand-me-down suit, worn, altered, and reshaped to fit the intentions of those who claimed authority. But today, we must dare to look again. We must ask who were the black Hebrews and what was their true connection to Egypt. Not the Egypt of modern tourism and postcard pyramids, but the Egypt of power, civilization, and divine legacy. The truth is, the black Hebrews were not strangers to Egypt. They were not simply visitors enslaved in some corner of Pharaoh's empire. No, they were deeply woven into the very fabric of Egyptian society, knowledge and spiritual legacy. They were in many ways Egyptian themselves by blood, by culture, by history, and to understand this is to reclaim not only identity but destiny. Let's go back not just a few decades or centuries, but millennia. Long before borders were drawn and rewritten, before race was weaponized, there existed a people whose presence defied the boundaries we now use to separate African from Hebrew, Egyptian from Israelite. These people were dark-skinned, brilliant, and deeply spiritual. They lived in a world where geography did not define belief and where ethnicity did not limit greatness. Ancient Kemet, known today as Egypt, was the cradle of wisdom. Mathematics, medicine, architecture, and astronomy were not imported there. They were born there. And those who built that world, those who carved knowledge into temple walls and aligned pyramids with the stars, were black. Their skin was kissed by the same sun that shines on Africa today. Their bloodline carried the same melanin strength and brilliance. The black Hebrews were part of this world, not outsiders, not strangers, but kin. When we examine the ancient scripts, the artifacts, the historical descriptions from outsiders who visited the region, we see a truth that's been whispered but never shouted. The Hebrews of the early scriptures looked like the people of Egypt, because they were part of the same ancestral lineage. The Hebrews who walked through Egypt didn't look like the sanitized versions in Western films. They looked like Nubians, Cushites, Ethiopians. Their features, their culture, their traditions all mirrored the African world around them. They were brothers, not foreigners. And while many historians have been reluctant to admit it, the evidence has always been there, quietly waiting for bold minds to lift the veil. You see, identity is powerful. It can build nations or destroy them. And for years, black people around the world have been disconnected from their spiritual and historical roots, told that greatness existed somewhere else in someone else's image. But if you study the migration patterns, the cultural overlap, the languages, and even the names, you begin to see the undeniable truth. The Hebrew people didn't come from Europe or Arabia. They came from Africa. And Egypt wasn't just a place of captivity. It was a home, a school, and in many ways a mirror. The customs they carried, the spiritual rituals they practiced, the way they honored life and death, all of it bore the fingerprints of Egypt, of Africa, of blackness. Even the names, Moses, Aaron, Miriam, these names carry echoes of the Nile, not the Tigris or the Danube. Moses himself was mistaken for an Egyptian. Why? Because he looked like one. Not only physically, but in demeanor and education. Raised in the house of Pharaoh, Moses was taught by Egyptian scholars, walked Egyptian palaces, and lived as one of them. His heritage may have been Hebrew, but his world was Egyptian. And he wasn't alone. Many of the early Hebrew leaders moved in and out of Egypt, not as enslaved masses, but as learned men and women of high stature. Joseph rose to power within the Egyptian government. His wisdom was recognized by. He saved nations from famine using the administrative skills he learned not in exile but within Egypt's highest institutions. This isn't a story of victimhood, it's a story of brilliance. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. If the black Hebrews were so connected to Egypt, why have we been taught they were enemies of Egypt? Why has the narrative been reduced to slavery and escape? rather than alliance and influence, because if the world admits that the black Hebrews were Egyptian in culture and contribution, it must also admit that black people were and are more than footnotes in someone else's story. It must admit that black people were architects of civilization, authors of spiritual thought, and custodians of divine law. And once that truth is out, you can no longer deny a people their dignity. You can no longer exclude them from the table of legacy. This is not about rewriting history. It's about correcting it. It's about pulling back the curtain that was draped over black identity and heritage. It's about standing in front of a mirror and finally seeing the full reflection. The black Hebrews were not merely people wandering in the wilderness. They were visionaries who walked with purpose, guided by traditions rooted in African soil. They were not disconnected tribes. They were part of a larger spiritual ecosystem that stretched from the Nile to the Jordan, from Ethiopia to Canaan. They were not lost. They were hidden. And maybe that's why this truth has remained buried for so long. Because hidden things are powerful. Buried roots grow strong in silence. And now, as more eyes open, as more voices speak up, the world is being forced to reckon with the real history of black people, not just in terms of oppression, but in terms of origin, not just in terms of pain, but in terms of promise. To say the black Hebrews were Egyptian is to say that black people are not imitators of spiritual greatness. They are the originators of it. They are not foreigners in the kingdom of God. They are part of its foundation. But don't take this as a call to superiority. This is not about being better than others. It's about restoring balance. It's about truth. It's about telling young black boys and girls that they don't come from chains. They come from crowns. That their history didn't begin on a slave ship. It began in temples, courts, and sacred land. That the color of their skin is not a mark of shame, but a reflection of divine design. The world is changing. People are searching for identity, for connection, for something real. And this message matters now more than ever. Because in a time where confusion is celebrated and truth is edited, we need voices that will rise up and declare what's been hidden. We need educators, artists, leaders, and believers who will dig deep into the soil of truth and pull out the buried treasure of black history. We need to stop waiting for permission to believe in ourselves. The evidence is already there. The bones in the sand, the carvings on the wall, the lineage in your blood. The black Hebrews were Egyptian, not because they traded away their identity, but because their identity was never limited to one box. They lived in multiple worlds, just like we do today. They were part of a sacred rhythm that beat across the African continent and flowed like the Nile itself, long, winding, strong. That rhythm still lives in us. In every step we take, in every dream we dare to chase, in every truth we dare to speak, we honor their legacy, not just as a historical fact, but as a spiritual awakening. So when they ask you who you are, don't answer with your job title. Don't define yourself by your bank account, your neighborhood, or the shade of your skin. Answer with the voice of your ancestors. Say, I come from greatness. I come from kings and prophets. I come from Egypt and Israel. I am part of a divine story that no one can erase. And when they ask you how you know, tell them history whispered it, your spirit confirmed it, and now the world must face it. This is your legacy. This is your truth. And once you know who you are, there is nothing anyone can do to make you forget. So walk tall, speak boldly, and never apologize for the truth, because it was never lost. It was just waiting for you to remember. The idea that black Hebrews were deeply integrated into ancient Egyptian society challenges long-held beliefs and historical simplifications that have shaped how we understand identity, heritage, and civilization. It wasn't simply that these two groups had passing interactions. They shared bloodlines, cultural traditions, and spiritual foundations that overlapped so naturally. It's hard to tell where one began and the other ended. The narrative that paints the black Hebrews as mere outsiders in Egypt is incomplete. It has ignored the overwhelming evidence showing that they were part of the same African landscape, breathing the same air, speaking similar tongues, and honoring many of the same principles about life, death, and the divine. The world has been conditioned to see Egypt as a place of mystery and wonder, yet disconnected from black identity. But this was Africa then, just as it is now. The Egyptians were black people with African features, African customs, and African spiritual systems. They weren't some mythological race that disappeared over time. Their descendants still walk the earth today. The ancient Hebrews who lived among them and at times ruled beside them were also African. They weren't guests in Egypt, they were part of it, whether through intermarriage, migration, or cultural blending. The connection ran far deeper than one of mere geographical proximity. It was identity. Shared, lived, and undeniable. When Moses was raised in Pharaoh's household, he wasn't mistaken for an Egyptian just because of his clothing or mannerisms. He looked like them. He moved like them. He was taught by the same scholars, fed from the same royal kitchens, and trained in the same codes of conduct and leadership. He didn't have to pretend to belong. He belonged because his heritage was as African as the Nile. The same can be said of Joseph, who rose to become a high-ranking official, whose wisdom and planning preserved nations. He wasn't viewed as an outsider when he stepped into leadership. He was recognized as one of their own, both in intellect and in appearance. These aren't tales of assimilation, they're revelations of identity already rooted in the land. The image of ancient Hebrews has been altered, distorted, and whitewashed by centuries of retelling through a European lens. But original artifacts, ancient texts, and the writings of neighboring civilizations consistently describe the Hebrew people in ways that align with African phenotypes: dark skin, woolly hair, and powerful presence. These were not characteristics of distant foreigners, but of people born in the sun-drenched lands of Africa. They were not borrowing Egyptian culture, they were contributing to it, evolving with it, and helping shape its spiritual and political direction. The spiritual systems of the Hebrews also mirror those of Egypt in many symbolic and practical ways. The reverence for the divine order, the emphasis on moral law, the practice of sacred rites, all of it echoes what was found in the temples and tombs of Egypt. This isn't about copying, it's about shared ancestry and evolution within a common space. These people didn't need to travel across seas to find sacred wisdom. They carried it within them. They lived it every day, and they passed it on through generations that were taught to forget. But memory is powerful. Truth has a way of rising to the surface, no matter how long it's been buried. This truth matters not just because it sets the historical record straight, but because it restores a stolen sense of self. For far too long, black people have been shown an image of themselves that begins in chains, when in reality, it began in crown. Their ancestors weren't just survivors of oppression, they were architects of civilization. To recognize that the Hebrews were black and deeply connected to Egyptian society is to restore a part of that broken image and breathe life back into the dignity of a people long marginalized. Acknowledging this connection also helps us understand the spiritual authority that flows through African descendants today. Their resilience, creativity, and innate understanding of the sacred didn't appear out of nowhere. It's inherited. It was forged in ancient cities, debated in royal courts, and lived out under the stars of Africa. The descendants of those black Hebrews still carry that flame, many without even knowing it. But once they do, something shifts. A new confidence, a new clarity, a new command of their future. So when we speak of black Hebrews and their connection to Egypt, we aren't trying to create division or elevate one group over another. We're telling the truth that has been overlooked for far too long. This isn't revision, it's restoration. It's about giving credit where credit is due. It's about showing young black people that their legacy is one of strength, not shame. It's about reminding the world that the black presence in ancient history wasn't minor, it was central. It shaped law, science, language, and worship. and today that legacy lives on. It breathes in the determination of a people still rising. It pulses in the rhythm of voices demanding justice, truth, and recognition. The more we uncover the truth of who the Black Hebrews really were, the more the world will be forced to reframe its understanding of Africa, of spirituality, and of human greatness. Because in the end, truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to be revealed. Once it is, it changes everything. Throughout history, we have been handed a version of events that often separates people who are never truly divided. One such division has been between the ancient Hebrews and the Egyptians. What many do not realize is that early Hebrews shared not just geography with the Egyptians, but also cultural, linguistic, and even physical similarities that made them indistinguishable in the eyes of surrounding nations. They weren't seen as foreigners by those around them. They weren't marked as outsiders in appearance. They blended in so seamlessly with Egyptian society that even the most trained eyes saw no difference. The connection between the Hebrews and the Egyptians is not a theory. It's supported by what we can still touch, read, and study today. Ancient artifacts, historical documentation, and linguistic traces continue to affirm the African roots of the Hebrew people and their undeniable relationship with Egyptian civilization. If we take a close look at the physical artifacts left behind, from stone carvings, papyrus scrolls, to burial murals, we consistently find depictions of people with African features. Broad noses, dark skin, thick lips, and tightly coiled hair were not anomalies in Egypt. They were the norm. And when Hebrews are mentioned in relation to Egyptians, they're not described as being noticeably different in appearance. That silence is telling. If their features stood out, ancient authors would have said so, especially in cultures where physical descriptions were a part of identification. But instead, the records show confusion at times, people mistaking a Hebrew for an Egyptian, not because they wore the same clothes, but because they looked the same. They walked the same streets, spoke similar dialects, and engaged in life with shared customs that were native to the region they both called home. Linguistically, the early Hebrew language carried influences that mirror those found in ancient Egyptian texts. The root structures, the metaphoric style, the spiritual symbolism, all of it echoes the kind of storytelling and divine reverence that was rooted in African soil. Languages do not develop in isolation. They evolve through interaction, through shared rituals, trade, worship, and proximity. The Hebrew people who lived in and around Egypt didn't simply borrow cultural tools, they helped develop them. They spoke tongues shaped by African rhythms. They wrote using symbols and expressions common to the land. Their communication carried the spiritual weight of Africa, not some faraway place disconnected from black identity. These linguistic parallels show us that the Hebrews and Egyptians were not strangers. They were intertwined in thought, in tradition, and in the expression of the sacred. Ancient accounts from other civilizations, such as the Greeks, further highlight the African identity of both Egyptians and Hebrews. These outside observers often describe the people of Egypt as having dark skin and woolly hair, the very same descriptions used when referring to the Hebrews in various texts. These similarities were not ignored. They were acknowledged by those who traveled through Africa and saw for themselves what history would later attempt to erase. It is not difficult to find these connections once you step outside the lens of European reinterpretation and return to the original context. There you find a world where Hebrews and Egyptians shared more than borders. They shared blood, wisdom, and a purpose that helped shape the civilizations that followed. The spiritual customs of both groups also offer insight into their shared origin. The Hebrews practiced a structured system of law, worship, and sacred rites that mirror what can be found in Egyptian temples and rituals. Both placed deep emphasis on cleanliness, on the sanctity of certain days, on dietary codes, and on divine commandments rooted in morality and balance. These were not accidental overlaps. These were signs of a shared moral code that had grown from the same cultural soil. When you look at the early spiritual practices of the Hebrews, it becomes clear that they were not newcomers to structured worship. They carried with them an understanding of the divine that had long existed in the Nile Valley, refined and passed down through generations of African wisdom. The truth is, the Hebrews were never meant to be understood as a separate race from the Egyptians. They were a people within a people, a branch of a larger tree. Sometimes that branch was separated by politics or ideology, but it always remained connected at the root. By recognizing this, we reclaim a part of African history that has been hidden in plain sight. The separation between the two was never as sharp as we've been told. The boundaries we imagine today were not the boundaries they lived by then. To see the Hebrews as African is not to rewrite history, it's to correct. Rewriting this history is not about taking away from anyone, it's about restoring what has been lost. Generations have grown up thinking that African identity begins with colonization or slavery. But long before those chapters, there were scholars, priests, builders, and rulers whose skin was dark and whose legacy was holy. The Hebrews were among them. Their trials and triumphs were African in every sense of the word. Their journey wasn't one of foreign exile in Egypt, it was a homegrown evolution. They rose in African lands, struggled in African lands, and were shaped by the soil beneath their feet. Today, this truth is rising again. Scholars are beginning to piece together what's always been there. People are revisiting texts, studying maps, comparing scripts, and lifting the veil that once distorted this reality. It is not just about history, it's about power. It's about knowing where you come from, because once you do, you carry yourself differently. You speak with conviction, you walk with purpose. And you know that your story didn't start in chains, it started in the cradle of civilization, among people who built, wrote, governed, and worshipped with an understanding of the sacred that the world still studies today. The Hebrews were not visitors in Egypt. They were part of the land, part of the spirit of that time. And by accepting this truth, we are not dividing, we are uniting the story once again. We are returning to the source. And from that source, new generations can rise, not just with knowledge, but with pride. Pride that they were never forgotten, only hidden. Pride that they were never outsiders, but always belonged. Pride that they were never lost, only waiting to be remembered. Moses, Joseph, and other key Hebrew figures were raised, educated, or empowered in Egyptian institutions, and this tells us something deeper than we've been taught. It means that their leadership, their intelligence, their spiritual grounding, these were all formed within the African knowledge systems of ancient Egypt. Egypt was not a foreign land to them, it was home. It was the soil in which they were nurtured, developed, and elevated. These figures were not shaped by some distant, disconnected land. They were born into and influenced by the most advanced civilization of their time, and that civilization was African in every sense of the word. When Moses was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, he didn't grow up as a stranger. He was treated as royalty. He was trained in the royal houses, educated by the best minds of Egypt, and exposed to philosophy, sciences, and governance structures that originated in the Nile Valley. That education wasn't just political, it was spiritual, moral, and deeply intellectual. Joseph, too, was not just tolerated in Egypt. He was elevated to a position of national authority. His wisdom was respected, his judgment was trusted, and he played a role in saving the nation during famine. This didn't happen because he was viewed as a foreigner with exotic ideas. It happened because his insight aligned with the intellectual traditions already respected in Egypt. His abilities were compatible with the systems already in place, showing how interconnected Hebrew and Egyptian cultures. Joseph's rise in Egypt was not accidental. It was possible because he understood the spiritual and administrative values that Egypt held sacred. He didn't come in with alien systems. He operated within an African framework, using African methods of interpreting dreams, forecasting outcomes, and leading with discipline and clarity. The idea that these influential Hebrew figures were somehow outsiders who survived in a hostile foreign land doesn't align with the actual historical landscape. These were black men living among black people in black civilization. Their presence in Egyptian leadership wasn't the exception, it was a continuation of a shared heritage. These men weren't anomalies, they were reflections of a much larger truth. The Hebrews were African people whose lives, achievements, and wisdom were deeply tied to Egyptian society. Their successes were not about surviving oppression from a foreign empire. They were about thriving in a familiar world, guided by principles that their ancestors shared with those of Egypt. They were not simply protected by Egypt, they were protected by their own people in their own region, shaped by the same sun, soil, and culture. These realities force us to look again at the story we've been told. It was not a story of an isolated tribe wandering through a foreign desert. It was the story of a people who had roots in African tradition. Raised under the shadow of pyramids their kin helped build, taught in temples their cousins served in, and leading with wisdom that was a reflection of the land they lived on. Egypt was not a contrast to Hebrew identity, it was a container for it. Egypt was not an enemy to their knowledge, it was the foundation of it. And that foundation was African, powerful, and deeply connected to the spiritual truths they would carry with them for generations. Even the moral laws and customs the Hebrews lived by share striking similarities with Egyptian values. Concepts of justice, cleanliness, dietary discipline, and divine order are mirrored between the two groups. This shows that the development of Hebrew law was not done in isolation, but rather in the rich context of African wisdom tradition. The Ten Commandments and the teachings attributed to Moses carry echoes of older Egyptian teachings like the 42 Laws of Ma'at, which emphasize truth, righteousness, and harmony. This isn't coincidence, it's continuation. It's evolution of the same principles, articulated through a different voice, but drawn from the same spiritual well. When we teach these truths, we're not just revisiting history, we're restoring dignity. We're showing that the people who shaped faith, law, and morality for generations were themselves shaped by African greatness. The influence that Egypt had on the Hebrews wasn't one of cultural domination, it was one of shared purpose, mutual respect, and deep-rooted connection. To say that Moses was educated in Egypt is to say that he was educated in Africa. To say that Joseph ruled in Egypt is to say that he was trusted in Africa. This perspective changes everything. It reclaims the narrative for people who have been told for too long that their story began in suffering. The truth is, their story began in strength. Their ancestors didn't just endure history, they created it, led it, and passed it down with pride. What we must now do is embrace this understanding and teach it clearly. Because when you know that Moses learned in African temples, when you know that Joseph governed in African courts, when you know that these leaders were surrounded by and shaped by African minds, you begin to understand that the divine path they walked was one already paved by their own ancestors. It wasn't a foreign path. It was a return home. And by walking that path today through study, truth-telling, and cultural restoration, we can return to that same strength. We can stand with our heads high, knowing we are not starting from the bottom. We are continuing a legacy that began long before oppression and still lives on in the rhythm of our resilience.
Modern portrayals have distorted the legacy of black people, reducing them to stories of slavery and struggle, while ignoring the truth of their ancient brilliance, their foundational contributions to human civilization, and their leadership in matters of faith, wisdom, and culture. This distortion is not accidental. It has been shaped over generations to rewrite the memory of a people whose beginnings were anything but small. When we talk about the Hebrews in the context of Egypt, we're not talking about a foreign tribe sneaking into a mighty empire. We're talking about a people who belonged, who were part of that greatness, who rose from the very soil that birthed temples, sciences, philosophies, and empires. The Hebrews were not strangers to that world. They were woven into it, shaped by it, and in many ways helped shape it themselves. And yet in today's teachings, that identity is too often stripped away, and in its place, we are fed a narrative of exile, of weakness, of separation from greatness. That narrative is incomplete. That narrative is misleading, and most of all, that narrative is unfair to the legacy of African people. The truth is, long before the transatlantic slave ships ever sailed, before colonization carved up the continent, before racism became a structure of power, black people were leaders in faith, intellect, and culture. They were building cities when others were still wandering. They were writing texts when others were speaking only by memory. They were mapping the stars, designing systems of law, and developing spiritual teachings that would echo across centuries. And among them were the Hebrews, living, breathing, practicing their beliefs in the heart of Africa, often right alongside Egyptians who were their brothers in heritage, if not always in ideology. This historical closeness mattered. It matters because when the world tries to convince you that greatness came from somewhere else, you can point back and say, no, it came from here. It came from us. Ancient African societies, including Egypt, were not just places of pyramids and gold. They were the intellectual and spiritual centers of the ancient world. And the Hebrews lived in that world. Their prophets, their judges, their priests, all were influenced by the systems around them. They learned within African frameworks. They spoke with African tongues. They practiced rituals that reflected African values of order, cleanliness, discipline, and reverence for the divine. These weren't borrowed traits. These were shared inheritance. These were elements of a legacy passed down from generation to generation within the same broad family of African civilizations. The attempt to separate them in modern narratives is part of a wider effort to uproot black identity from its true source. It's a way of cutting people off from their power, their pride, and their past. This is why the story of the Hebrews and Egyptians matters so much. Because when it's told right, it reconnects African people with their strength. It shows that faith and culture did not arrive on slave ships or through colonizers. It was already there. It was already deep. It was already divine. And that story has not vanished. It has only been buried beneath centuries of misunderstanding, distortion, and silence. But the evidence remains. In the stone walls of temples, in the scrolls of ancient scribes, in the oral traditions passed down through families who never forgot who they were, even when the world tried to tell them otherwise. What the world needs now is not a new history, but a restored one. A history that returns people to the truth of who they are. A truth that says you are not the descendant of weakness, but of wisdom. You are not the child of chains, but of kings, queens, priests, and prophets. Your ancestors walked with dignity, spoke with insight, and governed with authority. The Hebrews of ancient times lived and thrived in lands that were unmistakably African, and their appearance, culture, and language made that connection undeniable. They weren't whitewashed figures from a faraway place. They were black people living through black history, leaving behind a legacy that still speaks today. When young people today grow up seeing themselves only in the context of trauma, they begin to believe that's all they are. But when you show them the full picture, the spiritual brilliance, the cultural richness, the historical reality, they stand taller. They walk differently. They speak with new confidence because now they know the truth. And once you know the truth, nobody can take it from you. That is the power of this message. It's not just a correction of history. It's a healing. It's a restoration. It's a return to wholeness. Let this truth rise in our classrooms, our conversations, our media, our family. Let it be spoken loudly and clearly that the Hebrews were not visitors in African history. They were a part of it. That black identity is not a footnote in civilization, but a cornerstone of it. And that the spiritual foundations we cherish today, were built not in exile, but in excellence. Excellence that came from the heart of Africa. Excellence that still lives in us today. Reclaiming the truth about Black Hebrew identity is a spiritual awakening that shakes the very foundation of what many had been taught to believe. It challenges the broken mirrors of history that reflect only fragments of our greatness, and instead offers a full view of the divine legacy that has been buried under centuries of distortion. This truth is not just about names, dates, or tribes. It is about purpose, identity, and destiny. It is about a people whose image has been reshaped to fit a narrative of suffering, when in fact they were born from strength. This awakening begins when we stop accepting surface-level history and start digging into the soil of our origin, because buried in that soil are the voices of ancestors who walked with power, intelligence, and divine instruction. It is not enough to say that we come from greatness. We must understand where that greatness began and how it was lived, practiced, and passed on. The identity of the Black Hebrews has been hidden not because the evidence was lost, but because the truth was inconvenient for those who benefited from falsehood. The truth is, these people were not foreigners in African lands. They were rooted in them. They thrived in them. They built communities, cultivated wisdom, and worshiped God in ways that reflected the beauty and complexity of their culture. When we examine the ancient paths of the Hebrews, we do not find them wandering in isolation. We find them living among other African nations, sharing languages, customs, and systems of governance that were undeniably African. Their connection to Egypt wasn't random, it was generational. They weren't merely visiting Egypt, they were shaped by it. They contributed to it, and they rose within it. To accept this is to restore dignity to a people whose image has been shattered. This restoration of truth is not just historical, it is deeply spiritual. When a person realizes that their ancestors were not slaves in spirit, but leaders, thinkers, builders, and prophets, something shifts within them. The way they walk changes. The way they speak changes. The way they see themselves changes. This awakening calls us to remove the chains that exist not just on the outside, but in the mind and in the heart. Because when you have been told that you are less for so long, even your prayers can begin to sound like begging instead of declaration. But the true story of the Black Hebrews shows that their walk with God was never about weakness. It was about covenant, purpose, and legacy. They were chosen not because they were perfect, but because they carried a divine assignment, and that assignment required strength, courage, and identity. This is why reclaiming that truth is not an act of rebellion, it is an act of restoration. We are not rewriting history, we are putting back the pages that were torn out. We are restoring what was stolen. And in doing so, we are reminding this generation that they do not have to search the world for validation. It already lives within them. Their story did not begin in chains. It began in royalty. It began in temples and deserts, in cities of gold, in councils of wise elders. It began in lands where God walked with man and wisdom was spoken in the language of the ancestors. And now, after centuries of silence, that wisdom is rising again. It is calling us back to the truth. Not just to know it, but to walk in it. Not just to remember it, but to live by it. This spiritual awakening cannot be ignored. It will not be silenced, because once a people wake up to who they really are, they can never again be made to sleep. They will teach their children differently. They will build their communities differently. They will walk through the world not as victims of lost history, but as carriers of eternal legacy. The Black Hebrews were not a mistake of geography. They were the divine blueprint of survival, strength, and spiritual identity. And by reclaiming this truth, we reclaim more than just history. We reclaim our voice, our vision, and our future.